When people hear the word megathrust, it might not sound like much, but in the world of natural disasters, it's one of the most dangerous things that can happen. A megathrust earthquake is not your typical ground-shaking event. These are the massive quakes that happen where two tectonic plates collide, with one being pushed under the other. These collisions happen in subduction zones, and when they release all that built-up pressure, the result can be truly devastating. To get an idea of what this could look like, we only need to go back to the year 2011, when Japan experienced one of the most powerful megathrust earthquakes ever recorded. That quake struck off the coast of Tohoku and caused not just intense ground shaking, but also a giant tsunami that swept inland, destroying entire towns and causing over $360 billion in damages. That single event remains one of the costliest natural disasters in history, and it shows just how dangerous these types of earthquakes really are. Now imagine if something like that were to happen again, but this time in a different part of the world that isn't as well prepared. Scientists have been warning about the Cascadia subduction zone along the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States. This fault runs from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia, and it has been quiet for a long time, maybe too long. Experts believe that if the Cascadia fault were to rupture in a full megathrust event, it could result in a quake larger than magnitude 9. That's strong enough to shake the ground for minutes, not just seconds, which is more than enough time to cause serious destruction. The first wave of damage would come from the shaking itself. Buildings not designed to handle that kind of movement would crumble. Bridges could collapse. Roads would crack wide open, and power lines would snap. People in cities like Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver could be hit hard, and even areas far inland would feel the effects. Hospitals and emergency services would likely be overwhelmed right away, especially if communication systems go down too. But the shaking is just the beginning. One of the most dangerous parts of a megathrust earthquake is the tsunami that usually follows. Because the ocean floor gets violently shoved upward during the quake, it sends a massive surge of water racing across the sea. In some places, there would only be a few minutes of warning. Entire coastal communities could be swallowed by waves taller than houses. In low-lying towns near the coast, there would be little time to get to higher ground. What makes megathrust earthquakes so scary is that they don't just affect one city or one area. They can impact whole regions at once. Ports, airports, highways, and train systems could all be knocked out in a matter of minutes, and once that happens, getting supplies, rescue crews, or even basic help into the disaster zone becomes incredibly difficult. Even the ground itself could change forever. These earthquakes can cause the land to drop several feet, which means that some places that used to be above sea level could suddenly find themselves permanently underwater. That's not just a short-term problem, that's long-term flooding that could wipe towns right off the map. This is why scientists are so focused on megathrust earthquakes. They don't happen often, but when they do, the damage is off the charts. The next one could hit without warning, and if it does, the question is not just where or when, it's how bad will it be. One of the biggest challenges with megathrust earthquakes is how little warning people get before they strike. Unlike hurricanes or storms that can be tracked days in advance, these earthquakes happen deep beneath the surface, where pressure quietly builds over decades or even centuries. Then suddenly, everything gives way. That moment when all the energy is released at once is what makes these events so powerful and dangerous. Researchers are using tools like GPS satellites and deep sea sensors to try and understand where this stress is building and how close we might be to a major event. These tools can detect tiny movements in the Earth's crust, sometimes just a few millimeters a year, but over time those tiny shifts mean something big is coming. Some areas, like the Pacific Northwest, have been slowly moving for hundreds of years without a large quake to release that pressure, and when it finally does happen, it won't be a small release. It'll be the kind of sudden, violent shift that sends shock waves for hundreds of miles in every direction. The damage wouldn't just stop at buildings and roads. A megathrust earthquake would also severely impact basic infrastructure, especially utilities. Power grids would be knocked out, gas lines could rupture and catch fire, and water systems could break down entirely. That could leave millions of people without electricity, clean water, or heat. Especially if it happens during colder months. In coastal areas, seawalls and flood defenses might be destroyed by the tsunami, leaving communities vulnerable to more damage after the initial impact. And then there's the economic side. Ports that serve as hubs for imports and exports could be destroyed in minutes. In the United States alone, Ports like Seattle and Portland handle billions of dollars worth of goods each year. If those are shut down, supply chains would be disrupted, not just locally, but globally. Everything from food and fuel to electronics and medicine could suddenly become hard to get. Large businesses might have backup plans, but small businesses and everyday people would struggle to bounce back. Insurance claims would flood in, and rebuilding would take years. Even 10 years after the quake in Japan in the year 2011, some coastal towns were still struggling to recover. Now imagine that kind of damage happening in several countries at once. That's the scale we're talking about when it comes to a megathrust earthquake. One of the most serious problems would be housing. With thousands or even hundreds of thousands of buildings damaged or destroyed, many people would be forced to leave their homes. Emergency shelters would fill quickly, and some people might not be able to return home for months or even years. In areas hit hardest by tsunamis, entire neighborhoods might be gone altogether. That kind of displacement can have long-lasting effects on families, schools, and entire communities. What makes all of this even more difficult is that megathrust earthquakes often strike areas that are heavily populated and near the ocean. That means there's a higher risk for loss of life, damage to property, and disruption to everyday life. These aren't isolated mountain regions with few people. They're often major cities, ports, and transportation centers that millions of people rely on every single day. And while scientists are getting better at understanding where these events are most likely to happen, predicting exactly when they will hit is still impossible. That's why so many researchers are focused on preparation rather than prediction, because when the next one hits, and it will be too late to prepare. One of the most dangerous things about a megathrust earthquake is what follows it. Massive aftershocks that can last for weeks or even months. Aftershocks might not be as strong as the initial quake, but they still cause serious damage, especially to already weakened buildings and roads, hospitals, emergency shelters, and communication systems that barely held together after the first quake could collapse entirely during one of these follow-up quakes. In addition to the shaking, the ground itself can shift in ways that completely change the landscape. In past megathrust earthquakes, entire coastlines have moved. In the year 2011, parts of Japan's shoreline shifted by more than 8 feet. That kind of sudden land movement can change the course of rivers, damage pipelines, and even affect underground aquifers. Bridges, railways, and highways could be left twisted or broken, cutting off entire regions from help. One of the most overlooked threats that follows a megathrust earthquake is disease. When clean water is hard to come by, sanitation systems are broken, and thousands of people are packed into emergency shelters, it creates the perfect conditions for illness to spread. In the aftermath of past earthquakes, outbreaks of stomach viruses, respiratory infections, and skin diseases have been common. If it happens in colder climates, things like hypothermia and frostbite also become major concerns, especially if heating systems are down for long periods. Farming regions near subduction zones would also be hit hard. Farmland could be flooded by tsunamis, contaminated with salt water, or completely shifted by the force of the quake. Crops could be wiped out for the season, and irrigation systems might be destroyed. That means fewer food supplies, higher prices, and even shortages, especially if supply lines are already down due to damage at ports and roads. There's also the mental toll. Survivors of megathrust earthquakes often deal with trauma, stress, and anxiety for years afterward. The constant fear of aftershocks, the uncertainty about whether homes and schools will ever be rebuilt, and the loss of loved ones all take a toll on people's health and well-being. Children in particular are deeply affected by the sudden change in routine and the chaos around them. Another long-term concern is how such a disaster would affect global cooperation. If multiple countries are hit at once, or if one country is hit so hard that it needs outside help, there could be competition for resources. Things like rescue crews, medical supplies, construction materials, and even food aid might not be available in large enough quantities to help everyone right away. This can lead to tension, especially if the disaster disrupts diplomatic or trade relationships. Scientists have even warned that megathrust earthquakes could trigger additional earthquakes in nearby regions. When one fault shifts, it can sometimes cause pressure to build up in surrounding faults. That means a single massive earthquake could start a chain reaction of seismic activity in places that weren't even directly hit at first. That kind of domino effect could cause problems across entire continents. Finally, there's the environmental cost. Landslides caused by the earthquake could bury forests, rivers could become blocked or redirected, and chemical spills from damaged factories or power plants could leak into the soil and air. In areas where nuclear power plants sit near fault lines or coastlines, there's also the fear of radiation leaks. These environmental disasters can take decades to clean up and may leave some areas unsafe to live in for generations. When we think about the next megathrust earthquake, one of the most important things to talk about is how communities can prepare before it happens. In places near subduction zones like the Pacific Northwest, emergency planners are focusing more and more on building codes. Stronger rules mean new buildings must be designed to sway with the ground rather than crack and fall. These changes might seem small, but they can save thousands of lives when a major earthquake hits. One major concern for coastal towns is evacuation. Because megathrust earthquakes often cause tsunamis, people near the ocean only have a short window, sometimes just 10 to 15 minutes, to get to high ground. That's why communities in places like Oregon, Washington, and parts of British Columbia have started building vertical evacuation towers. These structures are specially designed to withstand the shaking and the waves, giving people a place to run if there's no time to drive inland. In many areas, especially along the Ring of Fire, scientists are pushing for better early warning systems. These systems can detect the first signs of a quake and send out alerts before the worst shaking starts. In Japan, for example, their system can give people up to a minute of warning. That may not sound like much, but it's enough time to stop trains, shut down gas lines, and tell people to get to safety. The hope is that more countries will invest in these systems before the next disaster strikes. Schools and hospitals are also being reevaluated. Many older buildings weren't built with megathrust quakes in mind. In places like Chile and Indonesia, major hospital upgrades have started, so that emergency services don't collapse right when they're needed most. In the United States, California has already spent billions reinforcing hospitals to make sure they stay standing during a major quake. These upgrades are costly, but when disaster hits, they can be the difference between life and death for thousands. One challenge that's harder to fix is economic resilience. If a megathrust earthquake destroys a major port, it can stall the economy of an entire country. Take the Port of Los Angeles or the Port of Vancouver. Both handle huge amounts of cargo. If they go offline, it doesn't just affect the West Coast. It can delay supplies across the country. This is why disaster planning now includes alternative routes and backup transportation hubs to keep goods moving even if major ports are damaged. Another area being explored is how nature can help us. In some countries, engineers are working with natural defenses like coastal forests and wetlands to reduce the impact of tsunamis. These natural barriers can slow waves down and help protect inland areas. While they can't stop the damage completely, they can reduce it enough to save lives and property. People are also being taught what to do when the ground starts shaking. Emergency drills are now part of school routines in many earthquake-prone areas. Families are encouraged to have go bags ready, filled with water, food, first aid supplies, and important documents. Cities are running simulations that test how well their response plans actually work. The idea is to make sure that when the time comes, everyone knows what to do without having to stop and think. One of the biggest lessons from past megathrust earthquakes is that rebuilding takes time, years or even decades. Some areas in Japan are still recovering from the quake and tsunami that hit in the year 2011. It takes a long time to bring back roads, homes, businesses, and a sense of normal life. That's why planning for recovery is just as important as planning for the earthquake itself. Who will pay for the rebuilding? How can communities make sure they rebuild smarter and safer than before? And in the end, the next megathrust earthquake will not just test buildings and roads, it will test how well people can work together. From local leaders to national governments, from neighbors helping neighbors to scientists and engineers building better systems, every piece matters. There's no way to stop the next megathrust earthquake, but by preparing now, we can make sure we're ready to survive it and to recover afterward stronger than before. Imagine if the Ice Age just never happened. No mile-thick glaciers slowly creeping across North America. No frozen tundras covering northern Europe. No massive ice sheets shaping the land we know today. It's a pretty wild thought, but let's think about it. The last major ice age, also known as the last glacial maximum, peaked around 20,000 years ago. At that time, giant ice sheets stretched all the way down into what's now the northern United States. But what if none of that ice ever formed in the first place? To start off, the most obvious thing is the temperature. Without the ice age, the Earth would have stayed much warmer overall. That means polar regions like Greenland and Antarctica might never have developed their thick ice caps. Instead of being icy wastelands, They could be covered in forests, grasslands, or even full ecosystems that we usually only see in temperate zones. Arctic wildlife as we know it, polar bears, Arctic foxes, seals might not exist at all. Their cold climate niches wouldn't be around, so they probably never would have evolved in the first place. Sea levels would also be completely different. During the last ice age, sea levels were over 300 feet lower than they are today because so much of the Earth's water was trapped in ice. If there had never been an ice age, all that water would have stayed in the oceans. That means the coastlines would be farther inland, and entire parts of the world we live on today would be underwater. Places like Florida, the Netherlands, Bangladesh, and even parts of New York City might just be gone. Coastal cities wouldn't exist as we know them. The shape of the land would be different too. Ice is heavy. When glaciers push across the land, they scrape and flatten the surface beneath them, carving valleys, shaping hills, and creating lakes. The Great Lakes in North America, those were carved out by glaciers. No ice age, no Great Lakes. Norway's deep fjords carved by glaciers over time would look totally different or maybe wouldn't even be there. A huge portion of the world's iconic landscapes were created by the movement of ice. Without it, Earth might look a lot smoother and maybe even less dramatic in some regions. And then there's the question of how life would have evolved. Ice ages didn't just change the land, they shaped life too. They forced animals and plants to migrate, adapt, or die off. In turn, that pushed evolution in new directions. For humans, it meant developing tools, shelters, and clothing to survive harsh winters. Without that kind of challenge, early humans might have had a totally different path. We might not have spread out across the globe the same way. Maybe certain populations would have stayed where it was warm and never moved north. That could have changed everything from cultures to languages to the entire timeline of human history. That's just scratching the surface of how different things might have been. The world without the Ice Age would be warmer, wetter, and possibly way less recognizable. And that's only the beginning. In the next part, we'll get into some of the scientific debates about whether the Ice Age happened exactly the way we think it did, or if some of the evidence might actually point to something else entirely. Now that we've pictured a world without the Ice Age, let's talk about something that makes this whole idea even more interesting. There's actually a debate among scientists, not about whether the Earth was cold at times, but about how much ice really shaped the planet. Some researchers fully support the classic idea that massive ice sheets rolled over continents and left behind all sorts of physical evidence, but others say, hold on, maybe we're not seeing the full picture. A big part of the traditional Ice Age story comes from landforms. Geologists look at things like U-shaped valleys, drumlins, and moraines. These are land features believed to be shaped by glaciers. They also point to glacial erratics, which are giant rocks found far from their original location, supposedly carried there by ice. But some scientists argue that water, not ice, could have done that too. In places like eastern Washington, there's a theory that catastrophic floods created some of the features we thought were caused by glaciers. The landscape, known as the channeled scablands, was once believed to be carved slowly by ice, but now we know it formed almost overnight from a massive flood caused by a bursting glacial lake. Then there's the ice core data, long cylinders of ice drilled from Antarctica and Greenland. These cores contain layers that trap tiny bits of ancient air, showing things like carbon dioxide levels and temperature shifts. They're like time capsules of Earth's climate. But here's where it gets tricky. Interpreting those layers isn't always straightforward. Some scientists question whether changes in the layers were caused by cold, icy climates or by other forces like volcanic activity, shifting ocean currents or solar cycles. It's not that the cores are wrong, it's just that they might not tell the whole story on their own. And let's not forget tectonic activity. Earth's surface is constantly moving. Mountains rise, oceans spread, and entire continents shift around. Some researchers say that tectonic forces could have caused a lot of the same features we credit to glaciers. For example, if a valley looks like it was carved by ice, could it actually have been formed by fault movement or erosion over millions of years? The idea here isn't that ice ages never happened, it's more that they might not have happened exactly the way we've been told. Science is always evolving, and as new tools and data come in, old theories get challenged. Even textbooks have changed over time. What was accepted in the 1970s might be totally different from what we think now. So when we talk about a world without an ice age, it opens the door to more than just a what-if scenario. It invites us to question how much of what we think we know about Earth's past is solid, and how much is still up for debate. In the next part, we'll take this further and look at how life, not just landscapes, could have taken completely different paths if the cold never came. If the Ice Age never happened, it wouldn't just change the shape of the land, it would completely change the way life evolved, including human life. The cold climate forced animals and early humans to adapt in ways that helped shape modern species. Without that push for survival in harsh, icy environments, evolution might have taken a totally different path. For example, many large mammals we know today, like woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths, were specially adapted for the Ice Age. They had thick fur, large bodies to conserve heat, and diets suited for the colder environments. Without an Ice Age, these animals might have never existed at all. Instead, the planet might have stayed dominated by species better suited for warmer climates, possibly more reptiles, insects, or jungle-adapted mammals. The colder regions wouldn't have developed the tundras and boreal forests we see now, and the ecosystems would have been completely different. Now think about humans. Our ancestors had to survive through extreme conditions during the last Ice Age, which peaked around 20,000 years ago. That meant building shelters, creating clothing, using fire effectively, and working together in small groups. All of that helped develop early tools, language, and even social systems. Without those challenges, maybe early humans wouldn't have had the same reasons to innovate so quickly. We might not have spread across the globe the same way. Migration routes were shaped by glacial coverage. When sea levels dropped because of the frozen water, it exposed land bridges like the one between Asia and North America. If the Ice Age never happened, many of those paths wouldn't have existed, and entire continents might have remained unpopulated for much longer. Agriculture also would have been affected. After the Ice Age ended, temperatures stabilized and large areas of land became perfect for farming. That shift, known as the Neolithic Revolution, changed everything. People stopped hunting and gathering and started planting crops, which led to villages, cities, and civilizations. Without the end of the Ice Age creating those fertile plains, farming might have started much later, or maybe not at all in some parts of the world. The Earth's climate also influences disease. Cold, dry environments help preserve bodies, but warmer, wetter ones allow bacteria and viruses to spread faster. In a world without an Ice Age, global health history might look a lot different. Some of the diseases that wiped out ancient populations could have evolved sooner or spread more quickly. In short, without that global freeze, the world would probably be greener and wetter, but maybe less advanced in terms of human development. We'd still be here, but who knows what we'd look like, how we'd live, or what kind of creatures we'd share the planet with. And that brings us to the final part, where we'll explore what the environment and modern world might be like today if the Ice Age never came. So what would the modern world actually look like if the Ice Age never happened? Well, to start with, coastlines would be completely different. During the Ice Age, so much water was trapped in glaciers that sea levels dropped by over 300 feet. When the glaciers melted, that water flowed back into the oceans, raising sea levels and flooding coastlines. Without that process, a lot more land would still be exposed today. Places that are underwater now, like parts of the North Sea or the Bering Strait, might still be dry land, connecting continents and creating entirely different maps. The weather patterns would also be nothing like what we know. Ice ages help regulate Earth's long-term climate by pushing cold air toward the equator and creating stable seasonal changes. Without that massive freeze and thaw cycle, weather systems might be more extreme and unpredictable. We could be looking at hotter tropics stretching further north and south, with fewer areas that experience regular seasons. The polar regions might still be chilly but not nearly as icy, which would mean less reflection of sunlight back into space. That change in sunlight absorption could have made Earth warmer overall. Glaciers also play a big role in shaping rivers and lakes. A lot of the world's most important freshwater sources, like the Great Lakes in North America or many rivers in Europe, were carved out by glaciers. If those glaciers never existed, it's possible that many of our freshwater supplies would be smaller or not there at all. That could have changed where people settled, which cities were built, and how civilizations grew over time. Even mineral resources would be different. Glacial movements helped scrape and expose metal-rich rock formations, making it easier for humans to mine things like iron, copper, and gold. Without glaciers doing that work, early societies might have had a harder time accessing those materials, which could have slowed down the development of tools, buildings, and trade. Modern agriculture would be another major difference. The melting of glaciers after the Ice Age left behind nutrient-rich soil, perfect for growing crops. Without that, Much of the land we now use for farming might have been less productive. Countries that depend on agriculture today might have looked completely different or struggled to develop large-scale farming at all. Finally, tourism, sports, and recreation tied to snow and ice, like skiing, snowboarding, or glacier hikes, probably wouldn't even exist. Some of the world's most visited natural wonders, like Norway's fjords or the glaciers in Alaska and Patagonia, wouldn't have formed at all. Landscapes would be smoother, flatter, and maybe less dramatic. So, yeah, if the Ice Age never happened, we'd be living on a very different planet. The land, the weather, the animals, even human life would all have taken a different path. It's wild to think that a few degrees of global cooling thousands of years ago ended up shaping almost everything we see around us today. Yeah, thanks for sticking around for this thought experiment. If you're into more mind-bending stuff like this, check out our playlist on hypothetical scenarios. Did you know that more than 70% of Earth's surface is covered by the ocean? Now imagine waking up one morning and it's just gone. Not a drop left. No waves, no tides. Just empty, dry seabeds stretching for miles where water used to be. If every drop of ocean water disappeared overnight, it wouldn't just be shocking. It would be the beginning of the most dramatic transformation Earth has ever seen. Right away, the ocean floor would be exposed. Trillions of tons of mud, coral, trenches, and ancient volcanic ridges now sitting under direct sunlight. You'd see massive canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, thousands of shipwrecks, forgotten underwater cables, and possibly things we've never even discovered. The deepest parts of the ocean, like the Mariana Trench, would now be visible to the human eye, but there would be no time to admire the view because things would fall apart fast. The sudden removal of that much water would create an enormous shift in pressure across the planet. Our crust would begin to creak and shift without the weight of the water pressing down. Coastal shelves that were used to holding that weight might rise, while land in other areas could collapse inward. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions would become more common, especially along the Ring of Fire in the Pacific. In places like Indonesia, Japan, and California, the risk of tectonic activity would skyrocket. Now let's talk about gravity for a second. The ocean isn't just big, it's heavy. All that water helps balance the planet. Without it, Earth's rotation might wobble slightly. It may not sound like a big deal, but over time, that small change could affect how long our days are and mess with seasonal patterns. It could even slightly shift the way Earth tilts on its axis, changing how sunlight hits different parts of the globe. Temperature is another huge issue. The ocean acts like a massive air conditioner for Earth. It absorbs heat from the sun during the day and slowly releases it at night, keeping temperatures stable. Without that, we'd start to see wild temperature swings. Daytime temperatures in many places could soar to record highs, while nights might become freezing. Think deserts, but everywhere. The areas that used to be near the coast would experience the most dramatic changes. Cities like San Francisco, Rio de Janeiro, and Cape Town could go from having mild weather to dealing with extreme heat during the day and bitter cold at night. And then there's the wind. Believe it or not, the ocean plays a big role in global wind patterns. It helps power massive systems like the jet stream and ocean currents like the Gulf Stream. Without those, weather patterns would change almost instantly. Storms would form in strange places, some areas would face non-stop drought, and others could get hit by powerful wind systems they've never dealt with before. Even the air would start to feel different. The ocean adds a ton of moisture to the atmosphere. Without it, the air in most places would become bone dry. Rainfall would stop in regions that rely on moisture from the ocean, and crops would start to fail. In some parts of the world, rivers would dry up because they depend on rainfall that comes from evaporated seawater. And one more strange thing, sea level would technically disappear, so our global reference for height and elevation would get reset. Everything from GPS systems to maps to construction planning would be thrown into chaos. Elevation signs on highways would no longer be accurate. Even airports and planes that use sea level as a base for flight data would have to completely update their systems. This is just the beginning. With no ocean left, we're looking at a chain reaction of problems that would touch every single part of life on Earth. And in the next part, we'll talk about what would happen to marine life and how entire ecosystems would collapse almost immediately. With the ocean gone, one of the first and most heartbreaking effects would be the complete loss of marine life. Everything from tiny plankton to massive whales would die out almost instantly. Without water, fish wouldn't survive for more than a few minutes. Coral reefs, which are already struggling today, would dry up and turn into chalky skeletons. Creatures that lived in the darkest parts of the deep sea would be exposed to sunlight for the first time, and their fragile bodies would not survive. This sudden extinction wouldn't just affect sea creatures. Entire food chains would fall apart. Seabirds that rely on fish would starve. Polar bears and seals, which depend on ice and ocean hunting grounds, would have nothing left. And it wouldn't stop with animals. The ocean also plays a massive role in feeding humans. Over 3 billion people today rely on seafood as their main source of protein. That food source would vanish overnight, causing global food shortages, especially in coastal countries and island nations. Then there's the fishing industry, which employs hundreds of millions of people around the world. In countries like Norway, Japan, Peru, and Indonesia, entire communities are built around the ocean. Without it, those jobs would disappear in a flash. The economic hit wouldn't be small. It would collapse entire industries, from seafood processing plants to boat-making companies and international shipping ports. The ripple effects would be massive. Tourism would also take a major hit. People love going to beaches, snorkeling in reefs, whale watching, and surfing. All of that would be gone. Beach towns that rely on tourism dollars, places like Bali, the Bahamas, and the coast of Spain, would become ghost towns. Hotels, restaurants, and tour companies would shut down, and the people who work in those industries would be left without jobs. The global economy would take a huge blow, especially in countries where ocean tourism is a major part of their income. But it's not just about jobs and food. The ocean is also one of the world's biggest pharmacies. Many medicines come from marine life, including treatments for cancer, infections, and pain. Some scientists believe we've only discovered a small percent of what the ocean can offer in terms of medical breakthroughs. Losing the ocean would mean losing all those possibilities, along with the chance to discover future cures hidden in the deep. On top of that, we'd lose one of our strongest defenses against disease. Coastal wetlands and mangroves, which grow near the ocean, act like natural filters. They trap harmful bacteria and prevent diseases from spreading inland. Without the ocean, these natural filters would die out, making it easier for illnesses to spread through dirty water and damage ecosystems. Even inland ecosystems would feel the impact. Rivers and lakes that connect to the ocean would see massive changes in water flow. Some could dry up, while others might flood. Plants and animals that depend on steady water levels would be thrown into chaos. Species would either migrate, adapt, or go extinct. And while the environment crashes, human society would begin to feel the pressure in every possible way. Food insecurity, job loss, and failing industries would all pile on fast. In many places, especially poorer countries, this could lead to protests, migration, and even conflicts over resources. With less food and fewer jobs, people would start moving inland, overwhelming cities that weren't built to handle huge population increases. This kind of crisis would not just affect one region, it would spread worldwide. In the next part, we'll dive into what happens to Earth's climate and weather when there's no ocean left to help balance it all out. Things would change fast, and not in a good way. Without the ocean, Earth's climate would start falling apart faster than most people could imagine. One of the biggest things the ocean does is move heat around the planet. It acts like a giant sponge, soaking up sunlight and helping to keep temperatures balanced between the equator and the poles. If all that water suddenly disappeared, there would be nothing left to absorb that heat. Places near the equator would become unbelievably hot, while colder areas might freeze even more than usual. Ocean currents, like the Gulf Stream, move warm water from the tropics up toward places like Europe and North America. These currents help regulate seasons, rain patterns, and even wind systems. Without them, entire continents would start to feel the change. Western Europe, which usually has mild winters because of the ocean's influence, would face brutal cold spells. Meanwhile, tropical areas would start to feel like ovens, and deserts could spread into places that used to be green and full of life. Rainfall patterns would also be thrown off completely. The ocean is a major source of the moisture that becomes rain. Without it, many parts of the world would dry out. Places like the Amazon rainforest, which depends on regular rainfall, could wither away. On the flip side, areas that already get too much rain could flood even worse. As strange weather patterns take over, it would become almost impossible to predict the weather anymore. Storms would act differently too. Right now, hurricanes form over warm ocean waters. Without the sea, those storms would no longer exist. That might sound like a good thing, but it's not that simple. Instead of hurricanes, we could start seeing new types of storms. With the atmosphere out of balance and no ocean to cool it down, powerful windstorms could rip through inland areas. Dust storms, heat waves, and sudden cold snaps could become the new normal. Some areas would become so dry they'd burn more easily, leading to more wildfires. Others would see thick fogs and strange shifts in pressure that damage buildings and roads over time. And then there's sea level. You'd think sea level wouldn't matter anymore if there's no ocean, but the sudden shift in pressure and gravity across the planet would cause the land itself to move in strange ways. Places that were once at sea level might sink or crack. Old coastlines would be full of shipwrecks, dried coral, and strange seabeds that used to be underwater for millions of years. Huge trenches and ridges would now be visible from space, creating a totally different map of the world. The air we breathe would also change. Right now, ocean plants like phytoplankton produce nearly half of the oxygen in the atmosphere. If they die, the amount of breathable oxygen could start to drop slowly. People with breathing problems would feel it first, but over time it would become an issue for everyone. Cities might need to install massive oxygen machines just to help people live normally. And without the ocean pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, that gas would build up fast, making the planet heat up even more. Even the seasons would start to feel strange. Winters might come later or earlier. Summers could be longer, drier, and more dangerous. Spring and fall might get shorter or disappear altogether. Animals that depend on regular seasons for migration or hibernation would be confused. They might start breeding at the wrong time or move to areas where they can't survive. Entire species could vanish just because the calendar no longer makes sense. As we continue, we'll explore what daily life might look like in this new version of Earth, how people might try to adapt, and what kind of world we'd be left with if the ocean stayed gone forever. In a world where the ocean no longer exists, daily life would become almost unrecognizable. The disappearance of such a massive body of water would completely change how people live, work, and survive. For starters, entire cities that once thrived along coastlines would be abandoned. With no ports, no beaches, and no water, there would be no reason for people to stay in places like San Francisco, Sydney, or Cape Town. These once busy coastal cities would turn into quiet ghost towns filled with empty buildings and cracked seabeds stretching for miles. Food would be one of the biggest concerns. With the ocean gone, seafood would vanish completely. Billions of people depend on fish and other marine animals for their protein. Losing that food source overnight would put enormous pressure on farms and livestock around the world. People would need to turn to alternative proteins like lab-grown meat or plant-based diets just to avoid widespread hunger. But even farming on land would be harder, since many farms near the coast rely on ocean moisture and stable weather. Without the ocean, crops could fail more often and prices would skyrocket. Transportation would also look completely different. Right now, cargo ships carry goods across oceans every day, connecting countries and driving global trade. Without the sea, international shipping would collapse. Everything from oil and gas to clothing and electronics would become harder to move. The cost of everyday items would rise and supply chains would fall apart. People would have to rely more on trains, planes, and land routes, but those methods are slower, more expensive, and not built to handle everything ships can carry. Tourism would take a massive hit too. Beaches, coral reefs, cruises, and seaside resorts would all be gone. Entire industries built around ocean tourism would disappear. Towns that used to welcome millions of visitors every year would lose their main source of income. Jobs in hospitality, water sports, and marine conservation would vanish, forcing people to move inland and search for new work in already crowded cities. The cultural impact would be just as huge. Think about how much of human history, art, and tradition is tied to the ocean. Stories of sea monsters, sailors, shipwrecks, and ocean gods would start to feel like distant fairy tales. Music, books, and movies about the sea would become a reflection of something lost. Even holidays and traditions based around the coast, like surfing festivals or seafood feasts, would disappear. People living far from the old ocean would grow up never hearing waves, smelling salt in the air, or seeing the sun rise over water. A major part of our connection to nature would be gone forever. The land left behind by the ocean would not be easy to live on. Much of it would be dry, salty, and full of strange, deep trenches and underwater mountains. It might take centuries before we could even build on it. Some explorers would probably try to cross the vast ocean floor, looking for secrets buried under the waves for millions of years, but without careful planning, these places would be dangerous and unstable, riddled with cracks, sinkholes, and sharp rock formations. In the long term, the human race would be forced to rethink how we live on this planet. Cities would need to be redesigned. Energy sources would need to be replaced since we'd lose ocean power. like tides and waves, entire ecosystems would have to be rebuilt, if possible. People might even start building massive artificial lakes or try to pull water from underground just to balance things out a little. But even with all that effort, the world would never feel the same again. Losing the ocean would change the planet forever. Life would go on, but in a way that feels unfamiliar, harder, and more isolated. This kind of scenario reminds us how deeply connected we are to Earth's natural systems. The ocean's not just water, it's life, culture, history, and balance. Without it, we would not only lose a part of the planet, we would lose a part of ourselves. Thanks for sticking with this wild thought experiment. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone else, and maybe go take a look at the ocean if you're lucky enough to live near it. Just knowing it's still out there doing its job is something we shouldn't take for granted.